Genesis chapter 28. And, who we choose to be married to is kind of an important decision in our life, isn't it? It's pretty impactful, pretty life-changing. And I know from experience, having parents who were... when my parents got married, they went to a very liberal church and didn't really... and my mom, I believe, was a Christian. My dad, hard to say where he was at really with the Lord. And they got divorced when I was about 8. And both of my parents married non-believers. Now, for my dad, he married a woman who was Catholic. For my mom, she married a guy who claimed to be atheist. He would say later that he was not really an atheist, but, just kind of kept God in the background in case he ever needed him, type of a thing. And it wouldn't be till much later that my stepdad, of course, divorced my mom and all of that, and a few years back came here and got saved, which has been very awesome. A lot of you guys know Jeff Pelagi. But it was interesting growing up in a family, where my mom was a Christian. My mom prayed, but she was married to an atheist, and then living with my dad for a while and seeing how that whole thing played out. And the blessing of it, I suppose, is that, of course, my mom, he divorced her years, and then later on she married a Christian, and now her relationship with that guy is a lot better. But my dad, his wife actually became a Christian years later. But until that time, it's just a really ugly situation, where one person is going one direction and the other person is going the other direction. And just the turmoil that causes, and I can tell you firsthand that is a painful thing to have two people who believe something different, and I'm not talking about different denominations of Christian, but, maybe something that is extra Christian or claims to be Christian but is not, and just, going different directions, and how much turmoil that and pain that causes, and just to see, that firsthand, I understand the pain, and maybe many of you have experienced something like that in your life. Now, you remember in Genesis chapter 20, probably 24 going forward, we've seen kind of just this progression of God working through Abraham and through Isaac, and now it's going to switch over to where God is going to begin to work in Jacob's life. And you remember that last time we saw Jacob, he was kind of pulling a trick on his dad, and through that whole scenario ends up deceiving his dad and making his brother very, very angry. And of course, Rebekah, his mother, seeing that his brother was basically saying, "I'm going to kill him the second I can," allows, basically wants her son to go away to be safe, to protect him. But she convinces Isaac that if he goes to where her brother is, Laban, that he'll be better off and he can find a wife there. And so we see in verse 1, it says, "Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, 'You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother.'" Now, it's interesting because if you turn to Hebrews chapter 11 with me, I just want you to turn there real quick. Hebrews chapter 11. And of all the things that we saw in Isaac's life so far, and remember that Isaac, in a sense, submitted himself when Abraham took him up on the hill to offer him as a sacrifice. He submitted himself to that. And, estimates are that Isaac was probably about 30 years old, taking him to the exact same place that 2,000 years later, Jesus Christ would die on a cross. And of course, just that typology of Isaac carrying the wood up the hill, and Isaac giving himself over to the will of the Father, and Isaac laying his life down. And you would think when you got to Hebrews chapter 4 that it would say all that. Or Hebrews chapter 11 rather, it would say all that. But it doesn't say that. In fact, all it really says about Isaac, if you look there in verse, let's see, oh, I lost my place. Thought I had it. Oh, it's up here. Okay. Verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. That's it. That's all we get. Of all the things that Isaac did, and what is amazing about that is that when Isaac was doing that, of course he'd gone blind. He's 100 years old plus. He's gone blind, and he sees these, or he doesn't see them, but he hears his son come in and say, hey, I'm Esau, and it's actually Jacob, and he tricks him, and he blesses him. And then, of course, you remember that Esau came in as well. He says, do you not have a blessing for me? And so he blesses Esau as well, basically prophesying over them what the things to come. But what was amazing about it is even though he didn't know who he was blessing at the time when he blessed Isaac, or Jacob, he still, it says, did it by faith. And that's kind of apparent when Esau comes in and he says, don't you have a blessing for me? And he says, no, your brother came in and received the blessing, and indeed he will be blessed. It's almost as though Isaac, trusting in the Lord, realizing the Spirit was speaking through him, spoke into this young man's life. And it's almost as though, just like when the prophet Balaam, who was not a prophet of God, but just kind of a soothsayer or a seer, if you will, when he prophesied over Israel, he couldn't speak but the things that the Lord put in his mouth. And so too it would seem, as Isaac was speaking over Jacob's life and over Esau's life, it wouldn't have mattered if they came in at different occasions. It's almost as though the Lord would have spoken the same blessings over them. And the whole trickery and underhandedness of the whole thing that Rebekah kind of pulled with her son Jacob, and Jacob, was in on, of course, and the pleading of Esau and all of that wasn't even really necessary. It's almost as if they would have just said, you know what, the Lord said you were going to be the one. If Rebekah would have had by faith, Rebekah would have said, you know what, Jacob, don't worry about it. The Lord's going to work it out. It's as though the Lord would have worked it out. But, of course, oftentimes we take matters into our own hands. But it was by faith that he blessed them. So these blessings that Isaac gave, not only did he do it by faith, but once it was done, he knew that it was God. He knew that God had spoken the word. And so he tells Isaac, I want you to go, blessed him, and he said, you're not going to take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, these, heathens here, but go to Padanaram, to the house of your sister's brother Laban. And so he's going to go to Laban. And it wasn't prejudice that he was against the people. And of course the daughters and the people of Heth, Abraham was very respectful of them, bought a field from them. They had kind of an agreement to live together. And so there was a mutual understanding and peace between these people. But the difference is that they believed in a different God. And basically, he says, I don't want you to take these daughters. And of course, remember when Eliezer, and just to kind of give you a contrast of those two cultures, nothing was safe within the Canaanite cultures. It was a perverse and very, very disgusting, sexually abused culture, and we know that from history. But when Eliezer went to find a wife for Isaac, remember he went to Padanaram. He went to the house of Bethuel, where Laban and Rebekah were the children. And Rebekah came out to the well, and she was, remember what it said about her? She was a virgin. She'd never known a man. And so here's a society that valued chastity, that valued the sanctity of a marriage, and so she was kept as a virgin. And there are cultures, and I've been there. There are cultures where nobody's safe, and it's like if you're 5 years old or older, you aren't a virgin anymore. And I remember when I was in Sandbite in Belize, and we were driving into the town, and just driving into the town, you could just almost just sense the darkness. It's such a beautiful place, right on the Caribbean, right there, and palm trees and everything. But just driving into the town, you could sense the darkness. And right there at the entrance of the town was this voodoo temple, and they were getting ready for a big voodoo festival. And what was amazing about that is I got to meet with a pastor by the name of Jim Menzie, and Jim was telling me that he had been brought to this town. Just the Lord just kind of led them to go there, and they'd been visiting Belize and just felt like the Lord was calling them to this specific community. So they'd been praying about it, and they'd found out just from studying the culture that every single child in that culture had been sexually abused. Every single one. It didn't matter. Uncles, aunts, the voodoo, the witchcraft and things that were practiced there were very, very dark. And what was really sad about it is that there in the town was a Catholic school, but if you know anything about Catholicism in other countries, of course, the head of the Catholic Church in the town was also the voodoo high priestess. And so it kind of made it very difficult for people to get away from that whole culture. What was cool about it is, as Jim goes to this place, he was telling me that him and his wife Anna decided that they were not going to do anything for an entire year. They were just going to go to the town. They were going to pray. They were going to get known by the people as good people, safe people to be around. Then they were going to plant. Their plan was to plant a church after a year. And so that was kind of the plan. So they bought a house, and they're being supported as missionaries to go down there. And their first week there, they moved in their house. Their first week there, they heard that just a few miles the other way from Sandbite, up in Plantation, which is kind of there's a bunch of houses. We got to stay in one while I was there, but right on the Caribbean, there's a bunch of beach houses just overlooking the Caribbean Sea. And right at the end of that little subdevelopment, if you will, was a little tiny, cute, just picture perfect white church with a crooked cross that just was right on the beach overlooking the ocean. It was just beautiful. I mean, just quintessential. Just go inside, and it was like all these cute little wood, altar and everything. And of course, they had the white plastic chairs, which is typical. But they decided, well, let's go down to that little church. I hear it's mostly Americans and Europeans, and so they just decided to go visit. And so they went into the church. Their first week there, they sit down, and a European man is struggling mightily through a Bible study for that Sunday morning service, and he just not the teacher, not gifted. And Jim and Anna just sit there and listen. And at the end of service, the dozen or so people that were in the church came up to them like, "Who are you guys? Welcome," And most of them are vacationing. Some of them are local. But they said, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm a missionary with Calvary Chapel." And they said, "You're a missionary? You're a pastor?" And he said, Yeah, I am." And they said, "Will you pastor this church?" So his first week he's there, he's given a church to pastor. So his plan was he wanted to get involved with the youth. So he goes to this town where there's probably about, maybe 300 children in this Catholic school that they have there. And he goes to the dean of the school and he said, "Hey, would it be cool if I just came here, once a week or twice a week, or if every day, if it's possible, maybe on a lunch hour or something? I just like to teach the kids some music. I play guitar and sing." And he's like, who are you? And he says, "Well, I'm new in town. I'm the pastor at the Plantation Church." And he says, "You're a pastor?" And he said, "Yeah." And he says, "Will you teach our religion class?" And he was like, "Well, I don't know about religion." He says, "All I know is the Bible." And he says, "That's okay. Whatever you want to teach, we just have to have a religion class, and we don't have anybody to teach it. And if you're a pastor and you're willing to teach our religion class, we'll give you an hour with each class every day." And he's like, "Sure." So the next week he started school, and so he's a pastor of a church. He's teaching the kids, and within a year he led every child in the entire town to Christ. And so it's amazing. And yet, looking at these kids and the fear that they have, and the demon possession that's rampant within that region because of the voodoo and all of that, there's a lot of fear and a lot of pain and a lot of drama, and that's a huge problem within Belize, is just this problem of, just a sexual abuse that's happening. And that was kind of the culture that was happening within Canaan at the time. And as you read about the peoples of Canaan, it just was rampant within there. And so you have these people who not only are sexually immoral, but also practicing paganism. And of course, God would tell his children, do not yoke yourself with people who practice paganism, lest you go whoring after, and that's the word the Bible uses, whoring after other gods. And that was often the case, and that's often what happens when people come together of different religions, that people are pulled into the practice or worship of another god, and it's evil. In fact, 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? Now, that doesn't mean if you are married to an unbeliever that you're supposed to be divorced to that person, because the Bible also says that you don't know if, God will lead them to Christ through you, and that happens too. It's a blessing when that does. But how much pain you save yourself when you determine in your heart, I'm not going to marry somebody who doesn't have a strong walk, or is walking with the Lord as strongly as I am. And I think that that's an important thing to think about. It's just one less thing, because you're not walking in the same way. And so that's what they want for their son. They want somebody who's going to be, on the same page, if you will. And Rebecca, when she came, you remember Isaac and Rebecca, at the very beginning of their marriage, she wasn't having a baby, and then, of course, after years, Isaac prayed for her, and God answered his prayer, and she was given a child, actually 2 children. And then when they were warring in her stomach, Jacob and Esau, she inquired of the Lord, and the Lord spoke to her. And so both of these people, Isaac and Rebecca, both had a relationship with the Lord. And that's kind of what they want for their son. And so in verse 3, Isaac goes on, he says, may God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. So this is what Jacob, from the time he was young, wanted. He wanted that blessing that was promised to his brother. That was basically, his brother was the oldest, and so he was going to be the one that would be the firstborn. But Esau didn't care about his blessing, and Isaac craved to hear that. No doubt he raised up on the knee of Abraham. Abraham was died when these boys were 15 years old, and so no doubt, told the stories of God appeared to me, and this is what God has done. And Jacob had a heart for that. He wanted the promises of God in his life. Esau, even though he was the firstborn, even though he was the one who was supposed to be the child of promise, he didn't care. And what's amazing about it, we see later on in the Bible this shocking statement that says in Malachi, Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated. And you see that repeated again in Romans chapter 9. And, people make a lot out of that. But just to make it simple, it's not that God hated Esau, if you will, as much as he hated what Esau stood for. And what Esau stood for was unbelief. He didn't believe in the promises of God, didn't want anything to do with the promises of God. And yet Jacob craved to be that one whom the Messiah would come through. And so Jacob was a man of faith. He believed God's promises and wanted them for his life. And Esau was a man of the flesh. He didn't care what God thought. And so, of course, one day Esau comes in from the field, and he's tired and didn't get any game that day and was hungry, famished, and he comes in and he says, give me some of your red soup to Jacob. And Jacob says, I will give it to you, but sell me your birthright. And so Esau says, what good is my birthright if I die? I'm going to die. Your kids act like that. I'm starving. Give me something to eat. But he sells he's like, yeah, you can have my birthright if you give me some of your soup. And so he sold his, that's how he was willing to give up the promises of God, if you will, almost like he was willing to give up his salvation for a bowl of soup to satisfy his flesh for a moment. It's pretty sad. And so that's why God would say such things. And yet, then because of that, Jacob and Rebekah hearing that Isaac is going to bless Esau, and Rebekah hears about it, so she's like, Jacob, come here, let's do this, and they pull the whole stunt and trick Isaac and steal the blessing, if you will. Although it didn't need to be stolen, God would have worked it out. But because of this, and Rebekah wanting Jacob to receive that blessing, and because of the trickery and everything, Esau was enraged. And of course, when somebody's living after the flesh, you don't want to make them mad, right? Because that person's just going to be intolerable. And so, of course, because Esau was enraged, he says, I'm going to wait till my father dies. My days of mourning have started for my father, and as soon as he's dead, I'm going to kill Jacob. And that was kind of the vibe that was happening. And so Rebekah would want to send Jacob away, talk to Isaac about it, and Isaac, of course, is doing that now, sending him away. And her thought was, I'm going to protect him. He'll go away for a few days until Esau calms down, but that few days is going to turn into decades. And, of course, Rebekah dies before Jacob even comes back. And that, just shows you there's consequences to sin. And really, what is Rebekah's sin? What was her sin? Was it deception? No, it simply was a lack of faith. She didn't trust God, that God could work it out. And honestly, that's where we fail, isn't it? That's why we manipulate. That's why we lie. That's why we do things that we're not supposed to do. That's why we don't live godly lives, is because we lack faith. We don't believe that what God has for us, is better than what we could have for ourselves. And we plan our steps, but ultimately God is the one who will order those things, and God is the one who's going to bring about His will for our lives if we will just trust Him through it. Now we see here that it isn't always clear to us what God is doing, but one thing is clear, is that God absolutely knows what's going on in your life. And God absolutely has allowed it in your life for a reason. And God absolutely has a plan. And yet you have to believe, contrary sometimes to the present circumstances, you have to believe that God is going to take what is in my life and He is going to work it together for good. And I think oftentimes we get down, we fail in faith, and it's more about, what I wanted and what I expected, and instead of saying, okay, God, I see that all this is going on, but I believe you have something better for me. And I think oftentimes we don't have it because we just don't believe that God will do something good for us. And ultimately, He will. And now let me explain that, because sometimes circumstances get really ugly, don't they? And yet, when we walk by faith, and our hope is in God and not in the circumstances, pretty soon, all of the depression, all of the anxiety, all of the bitterness from failed expectations and things going wrong turns into joy. And I have seen that so many times. I've seen people who've come in, the worst things in the world are happening to them, and I encourage them to just pour themselves into the Lord, to seek the Lord with all their heart, to find Him, to not let go until He blesses them, type of a seeking of the Lord. And in the midst of their circumstances, if they will, because I'd say it's probably maybe 1% or maybe 10%, I don't know. It's a small percentage of people who actually will take that advice and just really start seeking the Lord and getting up and meeting the Lord. And if they do, they find themselves happier, and this I've had people tell me this so many times, I'm happier than I've ever been in my life, even though everything is in turmoil. And why? The only difference is they just decided to find Jesus in that circumstance. And when they do, they're surprised by joy. They're surprised that they can feel the fullness of God even in the midst of their circumstances. So whether things are going good or whether things are going bad, Jesus is what satisfies us. And nothing else will. No right job or right circumstance or right home or right, whatever. Nothing satisfies us except for Him. And so trying to find satisfaction in anything else, relationships or, whatever, always ends up in despair. And this is what I've discovered over the years, is I've discovered that if I can enjoy the Lord, if I can find my joy in Him and realize that in His presence is fullness of joy, and in the midst of circumstances, no matter how bad they are, I can have peace and I can have joy because I know Jesus, then all of a sudden something changes. And now, all of a sudden, I enjoy my job, I enjoy my kids, I enjoy my wife, I enjoy my house, I enjoy all the things that could be burdens in my life. I enjoy them because Jesus gives me the strength to go through them. And that's the secret to a happy life for a Christian. To find Jesus to be sufficient. To find Him to be the center of everything. And that is the path, and not where Jacob's at, but that's the path that Jacob is on. And so because he desired that blessing, I want to know God. I want that for my life. God will eventually, even though he did some tricky things to get there, God, in spite of that, even though he's a bonehead, will meet him. Will meet him and he will find that. So it says, verse 5, so Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban the son of Bethuel the Syrian, the brother of Rebekah and the mother of Jacob and Esau. So he's going to get a first cousin wife. Now that seems a little bit redneck to us, but back in those days, of course, they're not too far from Adam and Eve, and so still the gene pool is strong enough. The DNA code is pure enough still, and the complex enough still that there's not going to be, all your kids aren't going to come out with like, hey, they're going to be okay. It won't be until the law that God will tell them, hey, don't marry your sisters and your brothers and your cousins. He actually separates it out to the second cousins. That's as close as you can get. And still today, that's pretty much the standard rule. But nowadays, when we see more and more birth defects, we see more and more disease, we see more and more allergies, we see more and more of those things because the DNA code, genetics, is wearing thin. And they say, scientists say that in 1,000 years, every baby will be stillborn. It's because genetics are getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and pretty soon they'll be inviable if time goes on long enough. Just because of environmental causes, birth defects. Do you realize that the things you expose yourself to, you can change your DNA so that your kids will all be born to have diseases? It's crazy. I was talking to a lady. She, her dad, a lady in our fellowship, her dad got exposed to a pesticide that made all of his sons be born with a specific type of cancer. And only the boys are affected. It only hits the male gene. Isn't that crazy? And so that, it gets, as time goes on, things get worse and worse and worse. Anyway, now you're scared. Sorry. Trust in the Lord, I said. But so he's going to go to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Syrian. And so Jacob's going to find Laban. He's going to meet him. He's going to meet his match. He is going to meet his uncle who is the same as him. And Laban and Rebekah must have learned to be tricky when they were little, because he's going to pull a major switcheroo, as we're going to see. Jacob marrying his beloved Rachel, and on their wedding night, just so excited, wakes up in the morning, and it's not Rachel, it's Leah. You know, it's like, oh, like, hey. You know, he's like, ah, you know, wakes up and it's a different woman. And of course he's like, what's going on? And he's like, hey, we can't marry off the young one. You know, she had a veil on during the ceremony. I wonder how Leah must have felt about that whole thing. Anyway, we're going to get to that. Really sad. But Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob. Now notice, it switches to Esau in his thought process. He saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take himself a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge saying, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. So Esau's watching this whole thing unfold, and he's already taken wives of the Canaanites. And it's almost as though he had no care as to what his parents thought, didn't inquire of the Lord. He just saw the first beautiful, what he thought to be beautiful woman or attractive woman or seductive woman or whatever, and he just went for it. You know, and that was his vibe. He didn't care what the implications were. It tells us in Genesis chapter 26:34, when Esau was 40 years old, he took as wife Judith, the daughter of Beri, the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. So these are daughters of Heth. They're part of the Canaanite people, Hittites. And of course in verse 46 of chapter 27, this is the way that Rebekah got Isaac to send him away. Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. So basically, my daughters-in-law are making me sick. You know, I can't stand these women. They're completely different than us. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth like these who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? I love how dramatic she is. I'm going to die but it was a serious thing. These women were not the type of women that they wanted their son to marry. And so verse 7, it says, and Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and had gone to Padan Aram. So a huge difference between Jacob and Esau. Esau followed his flesh, just went after what he wanted. But Jacob said, hey, I'm going to do what my parents are instructing me to do. I want to do the right thing. And that's kind of the heart that he had, was I want to be the right type of kid. And I want to know about this God that I've heard about. And so he had a desire to follow his parents' advice, and he wanted the blessings of the family. In verse 8 it says, also Esau saw the daughters of the Canaan. The daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. So Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife in addition to the wives he had. So it's interesting how he's seeking for his father's approval. He's we don't want you to marry the daughters of Canaan, so he's like, well, maybe if I marry a family member like my brother's supposed to do, that will make Dad happy. I don't know if you guys have ever been in that place. Well, maybe if I do this, my dad will be happy with me. Or maybe if I do, it's amazing the power that is there. It's like mothers are nurturers. They love their children. Fathers are providers. It's much harder for a father to show his affection to his children oftentimes. And, kind of leaves the raising of the kids to the mother oftentimes. And it's amazing how important it is for kids to feel that their fathers are proud of them, and men especially, but also daughters. Daughters want their father to be proud of them. They want their father's approval. And so he goes to great lengths to try to get the approval of his father, but, again, not really the type of thing that his father wanted. Ishmael, again, was a work of the flesh. Remember the whole business with Hagar, and Ishmael was born and was a grief to Isaac in that whole situation. So Esau didn't ask his parents for wisdom or guidance. Didn't ask God for guidance. Just kind of went after his flesh, and then he just kind of tried to solve the problem on his own. The reality is when things go wrong in our lives, we can do a lot of damage just by trying to fix things without just asking God. You know, and I think that that's always the best, is just to go before the Lord and say, Lord, I just want what you want in my life. And I need you to show me what you want, where you want me to go. Because God is very personal. And He desires to know, or for you to know Him and to know you in an intimate way. You know, it's amazing because it says in the Bible in Matthew chapter 7 that many will come to me in that day and say, Lord, Lord. You know, they're calling Jesus Lord. And they're saying, didn't we do all these wonderful works in your name? And He says to these religious people that call on somebody named Jesus, He says to them, depart from me, I never knew you. And that's a scary thing. You know, to have a religion where you're worshiping somebody named Jesus and yet not to know Him. Not to have a personal and real experience with Jesus Christ. And there's so many people around the world who have a form of godliness but deny the power thereof. They don't really know God. And people filling churches all over the United States, all over the world, who are religious. They do a lot of works, but it isn't works that save you. It's knowing Jesus. You know, that's what Jesus said. In fact, in John chapter 17, verse 3, He said, this is eternal life. And think about that. This is eternal life. This is what Jesus is about to tell us what eternal life is. This is eternal life, that they might know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. Eternal life is knowing God, knowing Jesus. That's where it starts. And Jacob is on this path where he wants to know God. He wants God's will in his life. He doesn't know much about it, it would seem. I mean, he does some stupid things. But he wants it. He's intrigued with this idea of the Messiah, of this child that will be born that will take away the sins of the world. He's intrigued with that. He wants that in his family line, where Esau didn't care about it. And so he's seeking after that. It says, verse 10, now Jacob went out from Beersheba, went to Haran. So he came to a certain place and stayed all night because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head and laid down in that place and to sleep. So he must have been really tired. He tried to check into the Best Western in Ramada, but they were all booked up. And he just finds a rock. Can you imagine? You're that tired that you're just going to find a rock. You know, it reminds me of what Jesus said. You know, foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. You know, Jacob, he's like willing to lay his head on a rock and go to sleep. And I want you to notice something. Jacob, so far, has never met the Lord. He's never personally met the Lord. Now, his father he's heard about the Lord. He's sought after what the Lord had. He wanted the blessing. He wanted the birthright. He wanted those things that had to do with the Lord. His parents have told him about the Lord, but he himself, and this is key, I think this is so important, he himself has never actually met the Lord. He's never had an encounter with the God of the universe. And so he goes to sleep, and something about this is he's still in the land. He's still in the land of Canaan, still in the promised land. He's in a place we'll find out is called Bethel. It's Luz now, but it's going to be called Bethel. And still in the will of God in the land, and yet no longer with his father, no longer with his mother, no longer with his brother. And it reminds me of something. Remember when Abraham first was approached by God, Abraham was told by God, I want you to leave your land, your father's house, your family, and go to a place that I will show you, which would end up being the land of Canaan, right? The place that God would give him as an inheritance. And so what did Abraham do? Abraham leaves, he goes to Padan Aram. He leaves Mesopotamia, goes to Padan Aram. Hangs out there for a while. His father, he brings his father with him, right? And his Lot, his nephew, brings them all with him. His father dies, so he finally leaves his father, goes to the land of promise. And then, goes down to Egypt and wanders around. And then finally, he says, Lot, you just go whichever direction you want to go, and I'll go whichever direction, you don't take. And Lot goes away, and then that is when he's in the land, when he's obedient to God, that's when God says, Abraham, Abraham. And he gives him all the promises. He's finding that place where he's alone, he's not being influenced by other people, and God is able to speak to him. The same thing with Isaac. Isaac kind of goes around, he's going to go down to Egypt, and God stops him from going down to Egypt, and so he kind of hangs out on the border of Canaan, and then, the people drive him from well to well as he digs wells, and they get stolen, and he finally ends up back in the middle of the land by himself, and then once he's back in the center of God's will, God again meets with him. So now we have Jacob by himself. He's finally going to meet with God. I think it's important to note that his parents' relationship with Jesus was not enough for him. His parents' relationship with Jesus is not enough for him. He has to find Jesus on his own. Nobody is born a Christian. You have to be born into the family of God. You can't be, your parents are Christians, so you can't be born Christian. You have to have an encounter with Jesus yourself. Otherwise, you're not born again. It's oftentimes the problem. Kids grow up in a Christian home and never have an encounter with Jesus. They're inoculated with a weaker strain and never come down with the real thing. And so we got to be mindful as parents to pray for our kids' salvation. To not assume just because they grew up and went to Sunday school their entire life that they're saved. They need to know Jesus. They need to have an encounter with God on their own, apart from us, really. And whatever that takes, to allow, to pray for them, to allow God to work in their lives and not to assume that they're Christians. So verse 12, it says, Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So he sees this amazing sight, a ladder to heaven. Not Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, different thing. But this is significant because what he sees is a portal, if you will, to heaven, to God's abode. When we talk about heaven, there's, of course, the Bible talks about heaven where God lives, and then there's heaven where the stars are, and the heaven where the birds fly. But this is talking about God's abode. This is talking about eternity. And he sees this hole open up, to heaven, and this ladder. It's really interesting. A ladder, and angels, it says, are ascending and descending on this ladder. Pretty amazing sight. Now, it's interesting because as far as mankind goes, this is really important to understand. As far as mankind goes, no man at this point has ever gone to heaven. In Jacob's time, no man has ever gone to heaven. Jesus, in fact, would say this. This is a really trippy, you think about Jesus, the deity of Christ, and him being God. He says something really bizarre in John chapter 3, verse 13. He says, No one has ever ascended to heaven, but he who came down from heaven, that is the Son of Man who is in heaven. You guys catch that? So Jesus is saying no one has ever gone to heaven except for the one person who has come down from heaven. So Jesus, at that point, when he came to earth as a man, was the only man who had ever come from heaven. From before that time, no man had ever been in heaven. It was God and the angels, right? And Jesus is the first man to come down from heaven. And now he says, no man has ever ascended to heaven, no one has ever gone up to heaven, except for me, the Son of Man, who is in heaven. So he's in heaven, he's on the earth, he's omnipresent, he's God, right? So it's a trip. But until Jesus died on the cross, nobody could go to heaven. The second Jesus died on the cross and our sins were paid for, then to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's what Paul would say. He'd say, I'd rather depart and be with Christ, which is far better, but it's more needful for me to be here with you. So, Paul understood that the second you die, you're with Jesus, right? You're in heaven. But nobody had ever been to heaven at this time, but Jacob sees this ladder to heaven. Now, what's fascinating about this thing, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So he sees this amazing sight, and in verse 13 it says, "And behold, the Lord stood above it." So God is standing above the ladder, and said, "I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth." Now notice this promise here. "You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and in you and your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So once again, the promise of God's people, the children of Israel, is given to Jacob, the same thing that was given to Abraham, same thing that was given to Isaac. And the promise of the Messiah is given to Jacob, in that all the families of the earth, through his seed, singular, would be blessed. And that's speaking of the Messiah, the Jesus coming into the world. And so he's given this promise specifically from God. And then God says, verse 15, "Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you." So God approaches Jacob with this covenant. And I want you to notice something about this covenant. It's salvation for Jacob, right? Now he knows God. He's met God. And Jacob is only left to believe. He's not given anything, he's not told, okay, now you need to keep all these rules. Now you need to follow my commandments. Commandments haven't been given yet, right? They won't be given until Sinai. He just says, I'm going to make these promises to you, and I'm going to keep you in these promises. I'm going to remain with you, and I will bring you back to these lands. I'm going to fulfill these promises. That's the way God is. God fulfills the promises. It never has been in us to be able to make it happen. It's always in God, and He is sufficient for all these things. And so the promise of the covenant is unconditional, it's free. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." I think it's interesting. God is here. God's not just in that place. God is everywhere. And that's the thing. I think that as Christians, we have an experience. It's funny because I've been with several churches, and I've been in a couple churches where the church was at one place and then they moved locations. And that's really hard for people because maybe you met God there one day, or maybe you got saved there, or maybe you've had spiritual experiences there, and now the church has moved to another location. And it disorients some people because they really feel like that place, in that tent, or in that tin can, or wherever you met, that's where God is. That's where I met the Lord. And, if we move down to another location, or we, move the church, then the Spirit's not here anymore. There's a danger for us as Christians, and it's this, that we ever think that God is not portable. That we ever think that God is located in a temple, or in a building, or in a church, or in a park, or wherever we think God is located. Because God is everywhere, isn't He? He's everywhere present. And the only thing that you need to connect with God is faith. To believe that God is here. He's here. He's here in the circumstances. He's here in the hospital room. He's here at the altar. He's here, wherever you are. Well, I'm lost in the woods. God is here. And His right hand upholds me, and He is here. And I can experience Him in my office, in a pulpit, in a pew, in the hospital room, at the store, in the bathroom, wherever I am. God is accessible to me, and He is with me even to the end of the age. It doesn't matter where I am. I can call out to the Lord. It's more about a matter of heart. It's a matter of my heart than it is a matter of where I am, right? And God can be there. I love that they used to have this thing that's basically had, it looked like it's all smashed together, but it looked like it said God is nowhere. You ever seen that? It's all smashed together. It says God is nowhere. But then you think about it, it's like you could say God is nowhere, or you could read it as God is now here. And I think that's an interesting concept when we think about, our life and God being with us. It's really us that determines whether or not we're going to open ourselves to an omnipresent God, or whether we're going to limit Him and say, I feel like God has abandoned me, or God isn't here, because He's always present. It says, verse 16, Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And Jesus is often in places where we do not expect Him to find Him. And I think that that's true for a lot of people. In the place where the last place, the lowest place in your life is oftentimes where Jesus meets us, isn't it? It's like when we are at the end, when we feel like everything has gone sideways, that's where Jesus ends up. One time, just kind of a funny story, my nieces were at a restaurant with my sister and her husband, and Kylie was probably about 4 or 5, and Kylie stands up and she looks at this table behind us and she says, God is in in that chair behind me. And they look back and there was some guy sitting there, and they're like, that's not God. He's like, no, it is God. It's God. It's Jesus. He's sitting right there. And they're like, no, Kylie, that's not God. And Jillian says, Kylie, God is not there. God is everywhere. And she's like, I know. He's right behind us. She's in that chair. And then she stands up and she goes, hi, God. I don't know what she was thinking of. Maybe she saw, we just wonder, maybe she saw Jesus sitting there next to that guy. I don't know. But he's often in places we don't expect. Now, this is what's really interesting, because this passage kind of comes to light in the New Testament in a really interesting way. You see Jacob, he's on the ground, sleeping on the ground, sees a vision of God, this ladder, and of course Jacob's just kind of this, he's full of guile, tricky and shifty and crafty, whatever, in his life, and Jesus still meets him, God still meets him there. But in John chapter 1, and in verse 43, it's just talking about Jesus, and he's kind of gathering his disciples. It says, the following day Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So they're everybody's excited. This is the Messiah. They start to tell everybody about it, and he goes and finds this Nathanael. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth was kind of like the ghetto, right? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. And so verse 47, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, behold, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. Right? Okay, so Jacob was deceiver, right? But now as Nathanael comes, he says, behold, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. Interesting. And Nathanael said, how do you know me? And Jesus answered and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is the only thing we can only speculate what's going on here. But Nathanael, it's speculated, was under the fig tree, very likely, no doubt, reading this portion of Genesis, reading about Jacob and his deception, and Jacob seeing this ladder go to heaven. And he's wrestling in his heart with Jacob, who's this deceiver, and probably saying, God, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be a deceiver. I want to be honest. I want to be upright. I want to be somebody in whom there is no deceit. And then Jesus comes to him and says, I saw you under the fig tree, a disciple in whom there is no deceit. And Nathanael answered him and said, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. So obviously Jesus had said something to him that made him believe that Jesus had supernatural power. Because he read his mind, basically, is what he's saying. Only God could know that. You have to be the Son of God. But this is what Jesus said to him. Notice this. Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And then he says, this is amazing. Most assuredly I say to him, most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open. Notice this. And the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. In other words, Jesus is saying, what you saw, what you were reading, that ladder going to heaven, that way to heaven, this stairway to heaven, I'm the way. I'm the stairway to heaven. You know, and I mean, that had to blow his mind. You know, Jesus knows all this stuff, right? And remember, Jesus said that. He said in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Again, no one's ascended to heaven but he who came down from heaven, the Son of Man who is in heaven, Jesus would say in John 13:3. He is the only way to heaven. You know, it's not by our good works, it's not by our trying, it's him. He's the way, just like he was for Nathanael, who wasn't a deceiver, but also, and maybe we relate more to this, to Jacob, who was. And I love that. I love that God uses these people who are complete boneheads, that make all these mistakes, sin, do all this stuff, and God still forgives them, still loves them, still uses them. It's amazing to me. It gives us hope. Verse 17, and he was afraid. This is back in Genesis 28. And he, Jacob, was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So it went from being a stony place to lay his head to the house of God. You know, he's like, this is, you know, God is here. Verse 18, and then Jacob arose early in the morning, took the stone he had put at his head, set up a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of the place Bethel, but the name of the city had been Luz previously. So it used to be Nut Tree. That was the name of the city. Luz means nut tree. And now he calls it the house of God. Now, if he wouldn't tell everybody that, they'd think he's from Nut Tree, right? But then Jacob made a vow saying, now this is really interesting, if God will be with me and keep me in his way, and that I'm going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Now, it almost seems like he's saying, okay, God promised me these things. Well, if he's going to do this for me, then I'll let him be my God. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think what he's saying, if God has said these things, given me these promises to take care of me, and to give me my food, and to keep me from going naked, if he's going to do that for me, yeah, absolutely he's going to be my God. I believe that that's what he's saying, not trying to bargain with God or saying, okay, well, here's the deal. And it says, verse 22, and this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, it's interesting. I'll give you a tithe. A tithe just means a tenth of what I have. And so he says, if you're going to bless me, if you're going to bless my life, then I'm going to give a tenth of it back to you. And that was kind of his promise to God. Now, it's interesting because God did not require a tenth of him. Isn't that interesting? Later on in the law, God will require that of the children of Israel, just like a tax. You know, basically, you have to support the priests that are work in the temple, and so bring a tenth of everything you have to support the work of the temple. But in the New Testament, there is no such law. In fact, it's interesting because it almost goes back to the way it was for Jacob, in the sense that it is upon me to meet with Jesus, and it's upon me to have enter into a relationship with him, and then as a believer in him, I freely, as a Christian, serve him, give to his cause. Those are the things that God has put on our hearts as Christians as we serve him and follow him. See, we're not under law anymore. There's no rule that you have to give a certain amount or you have to do certain things. In fact, it goes from law to grace, right? He's given us a covenant of better promises built on better things, right? Built on His blood. And where the children of Israel were under the law, when we get saved, we die to the law. And so now it's upon us as Christians to live by faith in God. And so the danger is there's a lot of people out there that are going to stand before God at the end. They're going to say, Lord, Lord, did we not give you 10% of everything we made? Did we not cast out demons in your name and raise the dead and heal the sick and do many wonders in your name? And He's going to say, get out of here. I don't even know who you are. You who practice lawlessness. I don't know you. And yet there's going to be others who come to Him and they say, Jesus, didn't you do everything for me? Yeah, but don't you remember you did this for me and you did this for me. When did I do that for you, Lord? Right? And it could, because it's not about keeping rules. It's about relationship with God. And therefore it's not about following a religion and checking off all my boxes and hey, at the end God owes me something. It's about, Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin has left this crimson stain. He's washed it white as snow. Now I'm going to give everything. My whole life is His. And it's not about faithfully giving 10% or faithfully doing this or faithfully doing that. It's about the faithfulness of God, and everything else from there becomes my response to His love. The money I give, the time I spend, the sacrifices I make, and all of them are minuscule. Not trying to pay Him back, there's no way, because His love is a free gift. But the things that I do out of an outpour of love for all that He's done for me. And that's what happens when we meet God. Before we meet God, it's just really all religion, isn't it? Before we have an encounter with God. And yet once we meet Him, we're changed forever. We're changed forever. And so my encouragement to us tonight is, if we've never met with God, if you've never encountered the living God, if you've never had that moment where you're saying, oh man, I didn't realize God was like that. I didn't realize God was in this place. Don't let time go by before you humble yourself. And it may be on your basement floor, or it may be in the attic, or it may be in your living room, or it may be in the bathroom, where you get on your face for God and say, God, I just need to know you. I just need to meet you. I need you to impact my life and show yourself to me in a real way, because I need to know you. And it is then when we humble ourselves before the Creator of the universe and say, God, I don't want my sin anymore. I want you. I want to follow you wherever you go, wherever you have for me, that He will take you and He will change who you are. And He will make His promises to you, and He will lead you, and He will expose you to things you never imagined in terms of knowing God and experiencing God and having a life filled with God. Don't go another day being religious. Don't go another day without knowing Him, without experience, without encountering Him. Let's pray.